Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. In this special series, I sit down with globally respected academics whose life work explores power, gender, negotiation, and leadership. Together, we unpack the subtle forces that shape how women are seen, heard, and valued at work. If you want deeper insights into the dynamics of influence and what truly accelerates leadership impact, this is a must listen. I'm your host, Melissa Hamilton, a former CEO who had the privilege of leading 5,000 people globally, and I unashamedly want to see more brilliant females in decision-making roles. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Professor Jen Overbeck. Jen, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's delightful to be here.
So, Jen, let me share with the audience who you are and then we'll get into our conversation. So, Jen Overbeck is Professor of Management and Associate Dean for Research at Melbourne Business School, a globally recognised expert on power, status and negotiation. She's published in Harvard Business Review and leading academic journals. Jen developed the power and influence material used in leadership training at the US Military Academy at West Point, and works with corporate, non-profit and government organisations on influence, persuasion and negotiation. Jen, a million questions and we haven't even begun, but let me kick off with one where perhaps I ask you to walk us through who are you as a human being and how did you get into studying power and influence?
Yeah, if you had asked me when I was 16 whether this is where I would end up in life, I would have said absolutely not. I was the child of two psychologists who were themselves the first people in their families to even go to college at all. And I was raised in a family that was focused on human services and how do we do well for people. But I ended up working in private industry. And in my 20s, I rose to the level of vice president of operations for the company I was working for. But I was always frustrated by a difference in values between me and our company owners who were venture capitalists. They were very focused on short-term quarterly returns. I was always very focused on how are we working with people? How are we delivering value? How are we living up to the mission of what we were trying to accomplish? We were a private educational company, and that mission was really important to me. So I decided to go back to school and earn a PhD, thinking that I would study human issues, psychology, actually. I grew up swearing I would never be a psychologist because I watched my parents do it. And when I told my dad that I had decided to go back to school for a PhD in psych, he cried, I think.
Oh,
He
wow.
was so overjoyed. But I was always interested in the business end of psychology, the organizational end. I wanted to know about how healthy, functional people working together in organizations can have more positive outcomes or more negative outcomes. I ended up in a stereotyping lab in graduate school just because that's the kind of research that my advisor did. That wasn't an area I had thought about studying either, but I'd always been interested in an incident that happened in the 1990s when I was working, which was the Rodney King riots. This is where a black motorist was pulled over by LA Police Department. He was beaten. That beating was videotaped. The officers were indicted, but ultimately they were found not guilty. And it was after that not guilty verdict that riots broke out in South Central Los Angeles. I was in Los Angeles that day with a colleague. And as we were driving back home to San Diego, we had this vigorous debate in the car about why did this happen and how culpable were the people who were, really burning down and destroying their own neighborhood. My my colleague felt that this was a really stupid thing to do. And my counter argument was, this is a community that tried playing by the rules, going to court, that failed them, and they don't feel any other sense of power or agency in their lives. And so they reach for what they have available, which is to commit violence at this time. And, we never resolved that debate. But by the time I got to grad school, I was still thinking about it. I landed in a stereotyping lab. I thought, well, maybe this has to do with race and income, those sorts of things. Maybe I can study whether those differences in views of playing by the rules make a difference in people's lives. It turned out I never found any relationships with race or income, but I did find that there were significant relationships that involved power, and that power seemed to be a real explanatory variable for why all sorts of dynamics happen. And so just over the course of a few years, I experienced something interesting. I wondered about it. I decided to go to grad school. I landed in a place with someone who was interested in nurturing a particular direction of research. And then that set the direction of my life for the past 25 years. So here's where we are.
How did you end up here at Melbourne Business School? Because we hear an accent that might not be Australian.
It is an American accent. I always get this wrong, but I believe I've been in Australia now for 11 and a half years. And I came for my job at MBS. Academia is a small community. A lot of us tend to know each other. And when I had decided to be back on the job market looking for a new job, somebody in my network heard about it and called up and said, "Would you be interested in coming to Australia?" And I can tell you, speaking of women and professional issues, that it was a big negotiation in my household. My husband was not sure he wanted to live in Australia, having grown up watching The Crocodile Hunter and thinking it could be a risky place to be. But the school brought both of us out for an interview. Australia is a wonderful place. I think Melbourne really sold itself, the quality of life, the constructive interactions that we had with people. We thought we'll have an adventure for a couple of years. And then here we are 11 and a half years later. We're citizens and that we show no signs of leaving.
Brilliant. Excellent news for us. So let's get into the core findings of your research and your work then, Jen. When we talk about power and influence, what do you mean?
This is a really strong focus for me in recent years, and I'm so interested in the differences between influence and power. So when I would use the word influence, what I mean is essentially it is something that comes from your credibility, your status, your legitimacy, the trust that people have in you. And influence is essentially your ability to persuade other people to do the things that you want them to do and to do them willingly, that they want to do those things. And what not my research, but research going back all the way to the 1950s shows is that you can build influence capacity. You can become somebody who has that ability to influence people voluntarily through two primary properties. Number one, you have to be seen as a member of my tribe. So you have to be somebody I see as one of us for me to even start listening to you in the first place. And then second, once I accept that you're a member of my tribe, then you need to be somebody who's competent at the things that I and the tribe value. So, essentially, if I listen to you, if I do the things by choice that you're asking me to do, then that's going to be a successful bet for me. And influence, I think it's important to say it's a long game. Influence is something that we don't have unless we build it up and really invest in relationships over a period of time. And then in contrast, when I say power, when I use that word, power is something that's based in control of resources. So with my colleague Nate Fast at the University of Southern California, I've identified some particular resources where power comes from. So if you control money, financial capital, if you control social capital, there's material capital, which is stuff or spaces. There's psychological capital, which is being able to affect how people feel. Anyway, if you control these resources and other people depend on them, then you can use that control to essentially demand the things that you want. So power is where I am imposing my will and I'm saying things are going to happen the way I want them to. Whether you want them to or not, you're going to have to do what I say, or else there's some suffering or pain or punishment involved for you. And so power is a short game. You can use it. If you have the power, you can use it immediately. And also, when you want something to happen, if you use power, you can usually make it happen very quickly. And if you use influence, then it unfolds more slowly. And I'll say one more thing that a lot of times when we look at how people use power in organizations, I'll use phrases, you'll probably hear me say this later in the conversation, like collaborative power or coercive power. Collaborative power is essentially I have power and I have influence, and I'm using them both together. So I could make things happen, but I choose to give you choices. And that's just backed up by the power that could be there if I needed it.
Okay.
And then coercive power would be, I'm going to use my power and I'm not letting influence into it at all. So I'm not giving you a choice. I'm making you do the things that I want and generally really leaning hard on that punishment piece of it to try to make you do the things that I want.
I immediately, when you say that, and thank you, fabulous descriptions of that, I immediately want to say, are people consciously making those decisions? Like, you know,
Not nearly enough. So I do a lot of work, as you mentioned, with executives. And one of the key things that we talk about in the sessions on influencing is that it's important to sit down regularly and really think deliberately, intentionally, and strategically about how do I want to use my power. Jeff Pfeffer is a management professor at Stanford, very famous for his work on power. And he has a book, I think from about 1998, called Managing with Power. It's one of my go-tos. And Jeff, he makes the observation that the leaders who spend time consciously thinking about their power and then being very intentional about how they use their power are more effective in a number of ways. There are a number of different organizational and personal measures we can use to see increased effectiveness when people are deliberate. But what I find more than anything is that people, we operate sort of on gut instinct. We have ideas of how to influence others. And a lot of times we may have intentions about how to influence each other or other people that may not pan out the way we expected. And when that happens, it's like, now what do I do? I just ran into resistance and I wasn't anticipating that. And so we may end up reaching for something like power, for example, that we didn't intend to use. So we intended to be very collaborative, but now you've been saying no to my proposals, which I put together really carefully and after consultation, and not knowing what to do next. I reach for power and just try to kind of force it through. And so we end up with people making choices about how to use power and influence that can be very at odds with their intentions.
so a couple of things there. A long time ago now, early on in the podcast, I interviewed an Australian leader called David Thodey. So David led our major telco, Telstra here for many years, and then is
Mhm.
sitting on a number of boards. And one of the things he said that was really interesting was just he always reflected on the number of leaders he saw who were brilliant, but were never going to get beyond a certain level because they had no self-awareness.
Mhm.
And I just wonder, listening to you talk about that, about the leaders
Yeah.
who sit down and very intentionally think about how they use power and influence, is it self-awareness doing that? Like, I don't know. I don't know. Do you see a connection in that?
Well, I do think that there's a connection. Yeah, I do. I think it's really hard for people to come to understand themselves as powerful. If you think about the trajectory over our life cycle of how we come to have power, so you've been a CEO. You can think back to yourself as an entry level worker when you very first started, and obviously then there's this continuum between that point and when you become a CEO. And at some point, you had to make a transition in your self concept
Mm.
to somebody who has power. And depending on your background, depending on your socialization, depending on a lot of things, it can be hard to come to understand yourself as a person with power. And like for myself, one of my examples is when I was in my 20s, sorry, 30s, and I had just started as an assistant professor. I was extremely busy and didn't have time to handle my own house cleaning. So for the first time in my life, I hired a house cleaner. And she would come over and I absolutely did not feel that I could tell her what to do. She would say, "What do you want me to do?" And it's sort of like, "Well, what do you think you should do? You're the expert. You should tell me what you're going to do." And I, reflected on that a few years later and realized that that was my discomfort because I was not accustomed to being in a position that was hierarchically superior to somebody. And this is true even though I had been VP of operations, but I was young when that happened. We were a flat, collaborative kind of company. I never really made the adjustment. But over years of being a professor, I came to understand that there is a hierarchical difference. And not only is there that difference, but it was my job to live up up to that role, that people who are in a lower position than me actually have needs and expectations of me to behave that way. They're looking to me for guidance. They're looking to me for clarity. They're looking to me to understand the guardrails. And when I fail to provide that sort of steady, confident stewardship, then they feel less secure, they feel less clarity, and their jobs become harder to do. And so the person who's in charge needs to own themselves as somebody in charge. But a lot of people, they have trouble getting there. Power may feel like a mask that they put on. It may feel like, something that's not authentically them. And so I think part of it is self-awareness, and part of it maybe is an acceptance of that powerful persona as genuinely and organically a part of who I am,
You're
if that
right.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Jen, you shared when you and I first met, you shared some research that you had done, which I'd love you to talk about. And I think that's where the collaborative and coercive potentially comes in. Am I thinking about the
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
go ahead. You should clarify just in case.
Yeah, so there was a group where you did research with a group of leaders and you were
Yeah,
asking their opinion. It was about how they were using power and influence,
that's
but were they
right.
collaborative leaders?
Yeah. Yeah. And, if it's okay, I'll back up and I'll give a little bit more of a picture, bringing together different parts of research, because I think the whole picture is actually really interesting. So, one thing that I think is important from research that I've done is that when somebody does come to understand themselves as a person with power, they can start to make certain errors. So there's a risk. We just talked about risks of not understanding that you are a person with power and that you have control over other people. But there's also a risk that comes when you recognize that you have power, but powerful people tend to blur the boundary between themselves and people in the organization below them. So there was a paper that I did, including several studies with a graduate student at USC named Vita Droutman. And we found that powerful people tended to think that whatever they felt emotionally was what other people felt, that their beliefs they assumed other people believed, and their opinions they assumed other people shared. And so there was this sense that whatever I think or feel or believe is representative of the group. And so powerful people might act on what they think is right, believing that what they're doing is representing faithfully everybody around them. And in fact, what they're doing is they're potentially becoming ever more kind of self-focused, self-anchored, and not paying attention to others. Not my research, but we do know from a lot of research that there's a reluctance for people to tell the truth upward, to speak truth to power, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're in an organization, if you're at the top of the organization, you are making these errors, people are unlikely to tell you that you're misaligned and that you're not really capturing what the group wants, but you're going places and saying what you want and then confusing that with what the group wants. So that's one body of things that we see. And then in the research I think you were just asking me about, this was an interview project that I did with a prospective graduate student several years ago. And we spoke to people in organizations who were in positions of power about how they thought about power, how they used power, what their values were around power. And the thing that was fascinating and quite spooky about this line of research was we would talk to people, and almost invariably they would tell us a story about how much they really cared about using power in a collaborative way, and how hard they worked and how much they tried to get participation. But in at least a few cases, we had access to what other people around them thought of these leaders and how those leaders were seen to behave by their subordinates and their colleagues. And in several cases, the story that they had told us in the research was radically misaligned with what we were hearing from other people. And it was invariably, I am a super collaborative leader. I care about involving people. I make sure that everybody's voice is heard. But what we hear is this person is coercive. This person makes one-sided peremptory decisions. This person shuts down debate, and it's a really unpleasant environment. And it was a really scary thing. So what people thought they were doing and what was being perceived by other people were very much at odds. And I think I mentioned to you the first time that we met that it was sad for me personally to see that it seemed to be much more likely to be women who were seeing this dynamic than male leaders. So women who were coming to work committed to being absolutely the kind of leader that we want everybody to be. And something was going wrong, and their colleagues were perceiving them differently. And I just want to mention, because it would be easy to believe, as I did at first, that this is a bias story, that women are simply being judged more negatively for the same behaviors. But that is not actually what seemed to be happening. And one of the reasons I know this is one of our researchers actually had an embedded position in one of the organizations and was able to do some independent confirmation. It was the behaviors themselves that were differing. And so what we were seeing was that some women, despite their best intentions to enact collaborative, constructive leadership, were falling into these traps where bad patterns were coming out.
So I want to pull both of those apart because the first one, when I think about that, is, I mean, for any leader, that's dangerous. That concept you used around self-anchoring,
Mm,
believing that everyone's viewing the world you do, the way you do, and the way you
yeah.
think. How does a CEO break that pattern? So what is it that they can do to not end up in that situation?
Yeah. I think everything here depends on building an information ecosystem around yourself and a culture around yourself that encourages telling the truth.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, eh, Cultivating relationships with a couple of trusted advisors who can, bring you information about how things are landing when you're not there to see how they're landing, or how things are being discussed when you're not there. And obviously, this takes deftness, because you don't want to plant spies in your organization and have a culture of tale telling. You want a culture of truth telling, right? You want to be sure that when people bring feedback to you, even if it's unpleasant to hear, that you have behavioral strategies, such as if you feel yourself, tensing up and having some emotional resistance to that message, then make sure that you discipline yourself to take some time before you respond to that, so that you can think about it and come back. I had this experience a few years ago with a dean at MBS, and I gave some feedback that was, I think, very confronting for this person to hear. And I could tell in the moment that they tensed up and they didn't feel very good about it, but they didn't say much.
Yeah.
They went away, and probably 4 or 5 days later came back and said, "I'm really grateful to you for telling me this. It was hard to hear. I
Mhm.
wasn't ready to respond to it, but here's how I've thought about it and what I think it means for me since then." And I could tell, yes, this was worth the risk to deliver that feedback, because it's going to benefit that person, and the person's taking it seriously. So, you can cultivate some behavioral strategies like that. And then I think, you can use things like 360s and tools that get you feedback. Also, I work with a PhD student named Craig Lewis. Craig has been using some of our work in his family life. And he's actually put a big poster on his wall that has some of our research patterns on it.
Mhm.
And when he's having difficulty with his kids, he'll go over and talk to them about, "Now, I'm working in this influencing collaborative space with you right now, but you're really showing me a lot of resistance. So we could jump up to the power
Yeah.
area and just handle it this way. How do you think it would be best for us to handle it?" And it's gotten to the point where his kids will come to him and say, "Dad, you're working in a power place right now. Like, you should really be talking to us with influence." And they'll negotiate how to affect each other's behavior. And they can do it very openly because they established a common vocabulary for it. And look, we don't do that very often, but there's no reason we couldn't surface more of these things and actually have these conversations.
I love that, Jen. I mean,
Yeah.
he is bringing up incredibly self-aware leaders who will have
I
the
can't
language
wait.
of
I
this.
cannot wait to see them in their 20s and 30s. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Do you know the other thing I was reflecting on, other than all of the incredibly good sound advice there around, make sure that you are asking for feedback and then not reacting when you receive it. I couldn't help but think it must be very, very hard being a dean in an academic environment with all these people studying power and influence and watching your.
Yeah, we also have quite a few people among my colleagues at MBS who study negotiation, and so I've heard that some of the deans and associate deans sometimes feel that the deck is stacked against them when they have to negotiate with us about salary or job issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can imagine. So, Jen, I'm going to, in a minute, I want to pick up the connection around female leaders because I think that's a super important place for you and I to focus. Before
Mm.
we get there, though, I want to ask you about West Point. And I
Oh
want to,
yeah.
yeah, I want to ask you about, you did the work there on the material on power and influence that they
Yeah.
use. Is it the same material we should all be following? Are there nuances? Like, tell me about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience. They found me, I mean, just through my general work on power and influence and contacted me to design this part of the curriculum. And what surprised me, I went into it thinking, all right, we're training future soldiers. So I need to talk about power and influence. I knew that both of them were important. I knew that in a modern military, you're not relying on force alone, you're relying on force and persuasion. And in fact, you want to rely on persuasion with the idea that force is just in the background if you need it. So I'm writing the material and talking about these concepts and balancing them. But where I kept being asked to do more revision and make more edits was that the US Army at the time, this is about 10 years ago, the US Army at the time was extremely concerned with developing soldiers of character. And so they wanted more moral content. They wanted more discussion of character. They wanted more sort of grappling with the ethical complexities around the balance of power and influence and how an individual might navigate the decisions that they face when they might need to have power in a situation, but they have to decide how to calibrate the use of that power. It was super interesting. I collaborated with somebody who was at the military academy and who was more from the soldier things. I can't remember if she had a civilian title or a military title, but she was immersed in the Army's environment. And so we worked together where I'm bringing the concepts and she's bringing the application. And it was really fascinating. It made me feel very optimistic about the direction of modern military training because it was clear that it went well beyond, let's just get out there and crack heads and use our fancy weapons. It was very much how do we become tools for, implementing what our government asks of us, but in a way that, first of all, will produce change that sticks.
Yeah.
So, hopefully we don't go into Afghanistan, make everybody hate us and leave and it all goes back the way it was. That one didn't work out, right?
Yeah.
But there is at least attention being paid to trying to do these things better, making influence stick and doing it in a way that's less costly, both in terms of lives and economic issues.
Mm. So fascinating to see your
Yeah,
research applied in so many different ways, I can
yeah.
imagine.
It was gratifying.
Yeah, so if we come back then to the research and the research coming out, and I'm glad you clarified that we can't just put that down to a bias, that there's more
Mm.
going on there. What is going on? What is going on when we see broadly more females viewed as, well, less collaborative, but really resorting to power very quickly is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to be clear. I do think that actually women, female leaders are generally viewed as more collaborative. I'm not 100% sure of my read on the research there, but I believe that the balance of research indicates that women are seen as more collaborative leaders. And certainly I know that women are trusted more as leaders in a setting where warmth and relational skills are valued. So we know that that's a strength. So the problem is happening in behaviors. And look, I think there are quite a few things. I'll mention a few that I think are important. One that I think is potentially the most explanatory is simply socialization. It's the way that little boys and little girls have grown up in the past. This may be changing now because of things like girls' sports. So girls are being socialized differently today than they were when I was growing up. But if you think about little boys and little girls, even now, you see little boys encouraged to have some degree of conflict. Fighting is tolerated, if not celebrated, among boys, and little boys can fight with each other and then go right back to being friends. Girls are encouraged to be more cooperative, to do play that is collaborative, that works together, that's relational and harmonious. And they're criticized if they're seen as bossy, right, or oppositional or competitive, other than in sports. So sports is a safe arena, but I don't know how much we're generalizing girls' behavior outside of sports. And, girls, when they do fight, girls' form of aggression tends to be relational aggression, which means, saying bad things about each other or spreading rumors or hurting people's feelings. It's very hard to come back from that and be best friends the next day, whereas boys can wrestle and sort of beat each other up a little bit and still go back the next day and be friends. So I think one of the issues is that those two different kinds of socializations give us a different idea of what respect and getting along and collaborating means. So if you think about being a girl where you have to cooperate, and if you veer into that space of conflict, it can be existential. It can threaten the relationship. Then you really need to stay in this narrower space. Whereas for boys, I think there's a bigger behavioral repertoire. You can be friendly. And you can be competitive, and you can even have conflict. And all of those things are accepted in cordial, friendly relations. One of the things I think that does to women is if we think about influence on one end of a continuum and just pure power on the other end, there's a space in the middle of that, which involves things like negotiation. So negotiation requires some influencing, and it requires you to have some power. If you lack those things, you're unlikely to be able to negotiate. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been working with even an executive group of women. And when we start talking about negotiation, and I ask people to raise their hands if they prefer to avoid negotiating, disproportionate number of women's hands go up. If I say, are you comfortable with negotiation? A disproportionate number of women's hands stay down. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's this whole set of behaviors where we have to ask for the things that we want, and we have to have an explicit give and take and kind of a bargaining that happens, that I think, women were sort of raised to feel like, well, that has its place. Women can be great at it in professional settings. And plenty of recent research shows that women are doing wonderfully at negotiating when it's under their professional label. But if it's for themselves, or if it's to carry out the things that they think they need to accomplish, and it seems therefore more personal, then I think that there's this idea that it's inappropriate to bring negotiation into it because that violates relational rules. So, I think that's a significant issue. And I'll just quickly mention that I think there are two other things that are also important. One is, for many women, I think the most vivid experience that they have of being somebody with power in the world is motherhood. And I have some research that hasn't been published yet, I hope, that looks at the notion that actually the mother role is one of the best recognized female power roles, and that people on average, male and female, respond really positively to the notion of a mother as a powerful, an archetype of a powerful woman. And so I think a lot of women bring their experiences of motherhood into influencing even in the workplace, but it's a really different experience. So, in the family, the mom typically has a certain amount of influence and respect and credibility just because of who she is. And in the workplace, you have to earn that in a way that's quite different. And also there's power that's built in to the motherhood role. And I think mothers and fathers, by the way, get comfortable saying, well, if you won't do what I say based on influence, then I'll use my power. I'll take away the iPad. I'll say you can't go have ice cream, whatever the case may be. And so it seems really comfortable to then try to transfer that style to the workplace. And yet it's a lot less palatable for people in the workplace to just be jumping from, you were nice to me, and now suddenly you're telling me I have to do this, right?
Taking your iPad away.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that's related to the final thing, which is that for a lot of women, I'm sure you've had this conversation many times, that I think women tend to come into the workplace with the belief that our merit will be recognized. If I work hard, if I perform well, if I'm great at my job, people are going to see that and they're going to reward me and they're going to promote me. And it's a real rude awakening when people come to understand it doesn't always work that way. In fact, that's not the rule, the most prevalent rule. Mostly, you have to have certain professional skills. You have to prove yourself. You have to be a bit political, and you have to work for that advancement well beyond whether you're good at your job. So I suspect, although I don't have data behind this, that women might come into the workplace thinking, well, because I'm in this role, people will respect it, and therefore they'll do what I say they should do. And it's like, no, now you have a title, but now you have to prove yourself and earn that credibility, that trust, that legitimacy, the competence with that title so that people will listen to you. And it's when that gap is missing, that people don't feel that they have, like, I can't get you to do what I want. I can't overcome your resistance. Now I jump to coercive behaviors.
So that's interesting because yes, I see that a lot in practical things. And what I see, the outcome of that is I see a lot of female leaders move into a more senior role and they take their old work with them because it's
Mm.
easier to do it than to find someone to or
Mhm.
ask someone to do that work. And then I think the second thing I see is, and I'm sure it's sort of where you're going with this really is, it's very hard to hold people accountable.
Mm.
So,
Mhm.
so therefore they resort to the take your iPad away move because I've got that power. We all need the chart in our office that that your colleague has got
Would be
with this.
helpful.
But practically, what can people do? Like what, I guess, and this is not just a female thing, but broadly executives, like
Yeah.
what are some of the warning signs that they are going from here to here, in a heartbeat without, putting in the work for the steps in between. And what is the work? What can people do to actually avoid this?
Yeah. So, in the work that I do with Craig, we've actually tried to catalog all kinds of different influence tactics that people use. We looked at academic literature and found a list of over 400 specific tactics that somebody might use to get what they want. And so, an example of an influency tactic would be to ask politely. Another example is to tell the other person what's in it for them, right? So these are very familiar tactics. Um, then there's, and I said that's a very influency tactic, very power focused tactics are things like threaten to fire the person or to, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
threaten to take away resources. There's slightly lower power things like monitor them, stay on top of them until they get something done. And then there's a bunch of kind of middle power stuff, and that's where you see the negotiation, where there's give and take. We're going to make a deal. We're going to find a compromise. I'm going to provide resources to enable you to do the job more effectively. And so there is this range. I think people can do that to some extent for themselves. I often advise people when I'm doing leadership training and influence training to spend 4 or 5 days just observing yourself in the workplace and saying what kinds of tactics do you use when you're trying to influence other people, and make a list of those, and you can go through and kind of categorize them for this is a high power tactic, this is a high influence tactic, this one's kind of in the middle. Look at what your balance is. And I think some of the key things are in in any workplace, you're going to spend a fair amount of time with a cluster of tactics that are about rational persuasion because that's just how we do things. I build a PowerPoint deck, I make the business case, I make the pitch, and those require some power, but they're very influency, right? So I'm going to see that on everybody's list. But beyond that, do you have a lot of things that are influence. I'm going to ask you politely. I'm going to make a joke. I'm going to try to be friendly. And then a lot of things that are power. I'm going to monitor you. I'm going to make a threat or take something away, etc. And if you've got those two clusters that are polarized, then even though you have a cluster down here, the fact that you have those polarized clusters, that's going to tell me, it's going to be a suggestion to me that you're running out of options in the influence space and you're jumping up to the power space. And you can track that yourself in your list. You can put down who was it with and in which interaction. And you can see, well, with Jim, was I in the influence space? And look right here, I jumped to the power space because Jim wasn't doing the thing that I wanted. And so you can get a little bit of feedback about that, I think, even without a poster on your wall. And so if you find that you're doing that, then I think the remedy is to brainstorm ways to, first of all, stay in one space for longer. So one thing, for example, might be with influencing, we know from past research that there are emotion focused tactics, there are relationship tactics, there are vision tactics, there are rational tactics. So maybe one of the things you can do is try to think about, well, what are two different kinds of tactics that I could use that are all in the influencing space, but that use different channels? So if I'm talking to Jim and the rational persuasion case isn't working, then I can brainstorm that compelling story of when this happened for somebody in our organization and it was a real success and it made a huge difference. And I'll try to get the emotion and vision channels through that story, right? And so let me have a few things that I know I can try before I have to move to something else in the influence space. And then maybe I can't stay in the influence space. Maybe I'm going to have to introduce some power. Well, instead of jumping to the stage of threats, maybe I can negotiate a little bit. What do you need, Jim, for this to make sense to you? What are the things that are holding you back from engaging with this proposal? Are there ways that I can ease some burdens on you that make it easier for you to spend the time that you need to do a test or an experiment or an evaluation? And so I think about, how do I escalate in a planned and incremental way as opposed to just getting stuck and panicking? And I think maybe another thing is to be really conscious of the role of time. So everybody in business today is overworked and has too little time for what they need to do. And it's very tempting to say, I just need to get these things done. I don't have the time for all this hand holding. I can't spend 8 different, persuasion steps with Jim. I just need Jim to get this done. And for that, I would just say, it's worth a little bit of a mindset review. There's the time for decision making, and I know you want that to be fast, but then there's also the implementation time, right? And if Jim doesn't like what you're saying, then you can make the decision, but that doesn't mean that it's going to get implemented in any, kind of time frame that carries out your goals. And so if we consider implementation time alongside decision time, now in that total amount of time, we actually might be able to make it shorter. It's just that most of it might be in the persuasion stage now, as opposed to, it used to be that we spent a tiny bit of time in the persuasion stage, and then we had to spend all of our time trying to actually make it happen once the decision was made.
So up the influence and get the buy-in,
Yeah,
and then get the person to move quickly once you've done that, rather than go to power and then,
exactly. Which is just burning capital and making it harder for you the next time.
yeah. Fantastic, excellent, great practical stuff for people to really go away and assess what are the relationships maybe they're having trouble with. So, Jen, that leaves me with the thought that, the challenge with some of that research is that we're talking about leaders who actually, they're not aware that they're being perceived that way. So, have you got any advice for people who, what do they do if they don't even realize that they're being viewed differently than they intend?
Yeah, it is really hard. And, again, I'll go back to the advice that if you can cultivate those advisors and people who will tell you the truth and will give you feedback, I think that's one of your best tools. But if you don't have that, or you want to go beyond that, then I do think that one of the things you can do is some self-reflection and self-assessment. So for myself, I am in an associate dean role at MBS. That's a leadership role where I have to make decisions. They're not always popular. I have to build support for proposals and I have to persuade people. So among the things that I do, because I have a real commitment to collaborative leadership, is I consciously look back at the behaviors that I've used in a particular initiative. So recently I've been driving a new performance evaluation process. I've tried really hard to gather lots of input. And then I go back and I'll debrief with myself after a meeting and try to see what kinds of influence tactics did I use? What things did I say to people? If I made a decision that was a bit of a one-sided decision, what things did I do to establish connection, restore with people, explain myself, and circle around to their participation again? Am I keeping that balance? So I'll do those things to keep myself in check. And that's something that I think leaders can do is keep the focus on the behavior, not beat ourselves up for failing to live up to perfection all the time. It's very hard for any leader to do everything perfectly. So we're going to lapse. Sometimes we're going to use power because we need to use power. And sometimes people are going to be unhappy and might see us as coercive in the moment because they just weren't happy with that decision, right? But on balance, on the whole, are we balancing those behaviors? Are we using a lot of collaborative behaviors? And are we checking in with ourselves to make sure that we're not getting out of touch with those decisions that we've made and how we've made them? I think those are some of the things that can help.
Such an important conversation because when we're talking about behaviors and self-awareness, it's things people can change, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I love that. I wanted to ask you, what's one thing, and maybe two or three, because I know when we first met, coming to one was difficult, but what do you wish every senior leader understood about power that they currently don't?
Well, I think one that's a real pet issue for me, if I were to choose just one, it would be to pay more attention to aligning hiring around how people influence. So, there's a lot of talk about culture. We talk about collaborative cultures. I think leaders know that they should foster a collaborative culture. We've seen debates about culture fit. Is culture fit a good thing or a bad thing to hire for? If we hire for culture fit, we might get too many similar people and have groupthink and lack diversity. But if we don't, we might get, people who are going off in all kinds of wild directions. What I believe I've seen, and my research with Craig is really focusing on this, is that diversity in a culture is great. Having different views, having some amount of healthy conflict over what we should do, even some differences over exactly what our values mean. Those can all be fine as long as the people who are in that organization have a value for and act on it for influencing each other in this collaborative, constructive way. So I'm not going to get frustrated, throw in the towel and say, no, we just have to do it my way. I'm not going to take my toys and go to the other room and not listen to you anymore. I'm going to hang in that conversation. And both of us are going to work on how do I bring you to my view voluntarily. And in the process, we're actually both moving to a common view. And I think we can do this better in hiring. So we ask people about things like, what's your cultural value? How do you work with people? And they will tell you the right stories, just like the people in my interviews told all the right stories about everything that they do to make a collaborative culture. So we need to see, what do they actually do? We need to do things like put them in a situation where there's some resistance or some friction in the hiring process and see how do they respond to the person they're interacting with. Or we need to put them in some kind of an interactive activity during hiring where they need to drive a change or get something accomplished through other people and see how do they go about making that happen with other people. And I think it's important to go beyond what people say about their values for influencing and see how do people actually influence. And I think we can do this a lot better than we currently do. And I think organizations would benefit tremendously. I mentioned to you in the first time that we met, one of the studies with Craig does some computer simulations to see what happens in groups when you have people with a collaborative influencing profile versus a coercive influencing profile, and then you change the mix. To me, one of the most important things that we observed was that you can have a completely collaborative group, maybe 6 to 10 individuals in a collaborative group, and you add one person who has a coercive style of influencing, and the entire group starts to become more coercive. And if you think about this in the real world, it makes perfect sense, right? You have a functional group, one person comes in and they say things during the meeting and then they go off and do something else, or they talk behind people's backs, or they try to do this covert horse trading. They undermine colleagues or leaders. And what people quickly learn is you can't just make an agreement with this person because they're going to do something different. So you have to play the games. And then pretty soon everybody is playing those games and we have a coercive culture. The opposite does not happen. If you have an all coercive group and you put in somebody collaborative, they don't become more collaborative at all. The collaborative person just learns to be coercive. So those changes seem to go in only one direction. And that's why it's critical to gatekeep at the beginning, that if you want your organization to stay healthy, you got to be ruthless in not letting people in who are going to be corrosive to that culture through how they influence.
I shared with you I made that mistake as a CEO. I hired too quickly into a particular role. I'm sure they won't be listening. They weren't with me. They weren't with me for very long. But I watched that. I watched one person who was coercive literally start to destroy the relationships at the leadership team level. And I was lucky because I had one of those brave, trusted advisors who came to me and said, "This isn't working."
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the other thing. You don't necessarily see it as the CEO.
You don't necessarily. You need somebody to let you know the effects that that person's having. Yeah. Just a quick side note. This is just a metaphor, but it's a story I really like that Adam Grant tells sometimes about. There was an animal, sort of an agricultural study that was done on egg production among chickens. And the bottom line of the study was that over several generations, the researchers were trying to select for the most prolific egg layers among chickens. And they successfully did that. But what happened was individual production went up, flock reduction went down. And it's because those most effective individual performers, part of how they ensured their position was to like peck and beat up the other chickens. Yeah. I'm going to do better, but at the expense of everybody else. And, I think we see this all over the animal kingdom as well as the human world, that there are people who can present themselves extremely well. And a salesperson, of course, they're going to present themselves extremely well, and they may have a great history of success, but sometimes that history of success has been achieved by very aggressive behavior toward others. And we just have to just pull up and look a little bit under the surface so we can see if that's been happening when we're hiring somebody.
It might be the headline of the interview today, Avoid the Coercive Chickens, Jen.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. The dangers of the super chicken.
Brilliant. So the final question, Jen, that I ask everybody is, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership mean, and do you think it needs to change?
Well, so when I hear that phrase, what I think of is the courage to go against expectations. And I say that because feminine is a word that has a certain set of stereotyped associations. And leadership is a word that has a different set of stereotyped associations. And the kind of cultural stereotypes around feminine and leadership are opposing stereotypes. But when you put them together, what do you get? You get the full suite of behaviors and options available to you. And I think the courage piece comes in because in either side of that equation, you're violating some expectation. So if you're being a strong agentic leader, you're violating something about the feminine stereotype. And if you're being relational and connected and empathetic, then you might be violating something about the leadership stereotype. And yet you need all of those qualities, right? We know that they are all important. And so feminine leadership in many ways is what everybody should have access to and be able to do. And I think for both men and women, it does take courage at any moment to to engage in behaviors that violate somebody's expectations. So I think have the courage, do it anyway, do what's right and not what people tell you should be doing. And that's what we need out of leaders.
Jen, that might be my favorite explanation. I feel so seen.
Oh, very good.
Because for me, that's part of the explanation behind it. So I love that.
Wonderful.
Jen, thank you so much for coming and sharing your incredible knowledge and insight and research. I know it's going to be so valuable, and I'm so grateful to have had you here.
It has been a pleasure, and thanks for the work you're doing, Melissa. I think that your voice is a great one for women and everybody to be hearing.